Hi everyone, this video I'm going to briefly speak about individual education plans, which are IEPs. There are samples there that are provided, but some are written differently. As you can see, you do an IEP after you have completed the evaluation process. Part of that evaluation process is completing a social history, which is done by the social worker. Depending on the state, so in the state of New Jersey, you have a social worker, a learning disabilities teacher consultant, which is the teacher on the team, and a psychologist. So the teacher on the team does the educational evaluation. The psychologist does a psychological, which is more cognitive. It gives you an IQ. So based upon that information, and it's usually the psychological and the educational that determines eligibility. A social history is an assessment type tool, and it cannot determine eligibility because eligibility is based upon standardized scores, and a social history does not produce standardized scores. So it's more of a supplemental piece and part of that whole process, because I'm going to give you an example. Someone may be low on an educational, where they may not be able to identify letters. But part of your social history may say they have not ever been to school. Does make that student or that child disabled? Not necessarily so, because it may not demonstrate that they can't learn or that something is interfering with their education. So you have to go back and do some interventions for that student to get some information and to see what they can learn. So that's where you can, the social history is a supplement. But an individual education plan is a plan for their education based upon each individual. And it's geared towards their education, and maybe because the measure is to what level do things interfere with their education. That's the measure to determine if someone is eligible. They may have issues, and that's where they can receive accommodations under the Rehabilitation Act of 1973, which is a 504 plan. And a 504 plan can also be carried into the workplace. So that goes a little bit further. But back to the IEP. So in the IEP, we'll have their eligibility criteria, when they were made eligible, what that classification that we say is. It gives demographic information, gives you a brief history in their present levels. That's where the teacher gives their report, because the teacher is part of the IEP team, but not necessarily the child study team. And those are two different, because the parent is also a member of their IEP team, where they want input in how their IEP should go. Because their level, if they're in a general education setting with inclusion, which means the special education teacher may come into the classroom, or they have resource, which inclusion is also resource. One is just in the class. One is they get taken out of the class. And then you have self-contained. Most of the time, or all the time, you want to look for the least restrictive environment for that student. Okay. And the least restrictive environment for some can be self-contained. The least restrictive environment for others may be in a general education setting. But you always want them to have interaction with general education students, because honestly, we have to look towards when they get into the adult world. There's no separation. Everyone is together. So it's best when you learn how to work with different people. As young as you can, you learn how to navigate. That's a lot of times the conversation I have with parents to encourage them, because being in a self-contained class may not necessarily be beneficial to them for someone to model the behavior and how they're supposed to be when they get into adulthood. You want them to have as much self-sufficiency and independence as they can. So, you want to, for lack of a better term, I want to say exploit their strengths. You look at that. So the IEP is a plan that helps you do that. It lets you know their education. If they have any related services related maybe to occupational therapy, physical therapy, or if they have counseling. Those are the related services, or speech therapy. I'm sorry. Also, you can also have a speech only, where things are fine on the educational side in regards to their learning and the psychological, but they may need help with their speech. And it's more of a hardware, with talking. So it's not a language issue. I had to learn that also because sometimes students, because they may be bilingual or familiar with multiple languages and they may not know the English language, we think that they need speech, but they don't need speech. We also may think that they're unable to learn, and that's not true. It's just that they are not fluent in the particular language that they need to be instructed in. And those are two different things. So when you build an IEP, it's based upon the evaluation process, and it's after a student has been determined eligible for special education services, and you have to build around it. They also receive accommodations for testing, and sometimes where their goals and objectives may be at, a lot of times the teachers choose their goals and does the goals and objectives, not the social worker or the psychologist. The teacher should do that. And if they reach that goal at 70%, that's their 100%. So that's kind of like a lower measure for them, but their 70% is their 100%. They have to be taught at the grade level that they're in. So if someone is in a 5th grade, they have to be instructed on a 5th grade level, but their work and the problems given to them can maybe be based upon their actual level. So they may actually be on a 3rd grade level. So that's the difference. Also, you have to take all of that into consideration when you do an IEP. An IEP for pre-K disabled, which I have worked, that's 3 to maybe 5 years old, or before they, usually 3 and 4 years old until they get into kindergarten, depending on the state. In the state of New Jersey, they're not required to attend school until they're 6 years old, which is 1st grade, depending on their birthday. So pre-K disabled is pre-K disabled. There's no categorical area. Once they hit kindergarten, that's when you may do autism, reading, other health impaired, math, cognitively, intellectually disabled. They don't say mental retardation or low-level cognitive, and there are 3 levels to that. So someone can also have an IEP if they have medical issues, but remember the measure is to what level does it interfere with their education. And in high school, you have to once they get 14 years old, depending on the state, they can participate. So they're also become a member of the IEP team. They can attend the meeting. They can sign part of their IEP. It's not a legal document. Once they become 18 years old, you don't necessarily need the parent at that time, but they can be part of the meeting so they'll know their expectations. And when they get 14, you have to start doing what you call transition planning. And transition planning is about going into adulthood. So you may, under the Department of Labor, refer them to Division of Vocational Rehab, where it may gear them up where they can start working. And you want to set them up for adult life. Remember about independence. Anything that you do, you want to think about what happens into adulthood. So the earlier you start that, the better. And they can begin to advocate for themselves because you want to set that up. So that's just a general type plan that you do, but it's very specific to a student. So when you look at those 3 IEPs, they may have different things. And a lot of times states or particular school districts use software to help with building those IEPs. So it will trigger you on how to do things. And usually an IEP may last for a year, but it is a fluid document, which means it can change. So you have to revisit it minimal of a year. Also, in the state of New Jersey, every 3 years, there's a reevaluation process. So you want to see, does that student still meets eligibility based upon their academic records? You may do testing again, depending on what grade they started. So again, if we did someone at pre-K disabled, when they go to kindergarten, they go through a reevaluation process, and then you realize they no longer meet eligibility because the interventions that were done were effective enough, and they no longer need that. Or they may still need it depending on, and then you begin, depending on what happened, and then you begin to categorize them. So you begin to see different things. So that's how the IEP is built. If you have any questions about it, please do not hesitate to contact me. Thank you.